Okay, we're going to go through the Middle East from 1200 to 1900. I'm going to go back a little bit before 1200. There's some things we need to hit so that you can see what was going on in that region by the time 1200 rolls around. And so for this region, what we need to focus on is the rise of Islam. So if you look at that map, you can see that it's all originating from Arabia. But by the time we get to 600, what would have been true of the Arabian Peninsula is that trade routes were coming into the southern part on the western side of the peninsula. They were running up that coast along the Red Sea. So you can see where Mecca is. Mecca had emerged as a trading city. And so what that meant for people in Arabia is that they were seeing their lifestyle transformed. They had been, in the recent past, Bedouin nomads. There still were Bedouin nomads in the desert of the peninsula. But in the city, as people moved from that nomadic lifestyle to the city, then it tended to lead to greater inequality and breakdowns of some of the customs. Along with that, people in Mecca were far more aware of the outside world. They knew about ideas like Christianity and Judaism. They had been exposed to it, but it just didn't seem to be a good fit for their culture. And so the kind of bigger picture here of world history is that we tend to see monotheistic beliefs develop as people become aware that the world is bigger than they originally thought. So when the Greeks become aware of the wider world, this is when they start to turn away from polytheism. It doesn't make as much sense that the gods live on Mount Olympus nearby. And so the same thing is true here with the Arabs on the peninsula. They were polytheistic, but as they become aware of the broadness of the world and the other ideas that are out there, they begin to question those ideas. All right, so the rise of Islam occurs when a man, a merchant, Muhammad, claims that he is receiving revelations from the angel Gabriel. And he goes back to Mecca, and at first this is not a big deal. It just seems like maybe a new kind of cult. But then Muhammad announces that this is a monotheistic religion that he's receiving. It's the same God as the God of the Jews and the Christians, he claims. And so once he announces that it's a monotheistic religion, this is a threat to the clans and tribes that run Mecca, because they were benefiting a good deal from the pilgrims who were coming to Mecca, to the Kaaba, which at that point was a polytheistic shrine. And so 622 is the date of the Hijrah, where Muhammad and his followers flee Mecca and they go north to Medina. And this is a transformation that occurs in the religion, because in Medina, Muhammad is the religious head and he becomes the political head. So as the political and religious head, Muhammad is setting precedents for other Islamic leaders that are going to follow him. And so the religion that has developed here is a great fit for the Arabs, because it includes within it some of the Bedouin principles. And so in Bedouin societies, nomadic societies where everyone was needed, you can see why charity for the poor would really matter a lot, which is part of the 5 pillars. He includes the idea of a pilgrimage to Mecca, the Kaaba. That's the Hajj in the 5 pillars. Compared to Christianity, which at that point was experiencing lots of debates over the nature of God and the nature of Jesus, and was there a Trinity, and what was Jesus like when he was alive? Was he God when he was alive? Was he a human? And compared to that, Islam seemed much simpler. It is, the phrase we would use is radically monotheistic. There is no Trinity. There is no incarnation of God as Jesus. There is just the one God. And so for a lot of people on the Arabian Peninsula who didn't have a lot of education, who weren't literate, then that's going to hold a lot of appeal as well. So that's the starting point But as with every religion, and we've mentioned this in other regions, when the founder dies, there are going to be disagreements over where the religion should go. And the first disagreement is over who should succeed Muhammad. And so it ends up being Abu Bakr and not his cousin and son-in-law, Ali. And so that, from the start, is going to create some controversy. The caliph is going to inherit Muhammad's role as being the religious and political head of the Muslims. And so then we see this expansion that occurs. And when we went over this the first time, we talked about how historians still disagree over what prompted the expansion. Was it desire to plunder the resources to the north? Was it the desire to control the trade routes, which had been shifting away from the caravan routes that ran through Mecca and up towards the Silk Road? But at any rate, when the Arabs expand, they are able to take advantage of the weakness of the Byzantine Empire and the weakness of the Persian Empire. Both were weakened by fighting each other, both were weakened by disease, and they very rapidly expand into those areas, and you can see across North Africa, into Spain, stopped in West Africa at the Battle of Tours. So the first expansion then is going to answer some questions for the Muslims. So one question is the religion universal? Because Muhammad was an Arab, his first followers were Arabs, so at first it looks like an Arab religion, in much the same way that Christianity, founded by Jesus, who is Jewish, his followers were Jewish, seemed to be a Jewish religion at first. So there has to be a question about, can other people become part of this religion? And so the Umayyads, who formed the first caliphate, the first empire, their initial response was no. You could convert, but you weren't a real Muslim. You still had to pay the jizya, the head tax that Christians and Jews had to pay. And so that's going to be one of the problems that they're going to have to answer, and it will be answered by the Abbasids more than the Umayyads. Eventually they're going to say, yes, it's a universal religion, anybody can join, and so Persians are going to become part of it, and the Berbers and North Africa are going to become part of it, and it will become a more widespread religion. And the other question that we have is, well, how do you rule all of these different places? The Umayyads used the old tribal framework of the Arabs in an effort to govern, and that failed. So as they conquer, what they would do is they would reward the elites with land. So they would say, okay, if you are a tribal chief and you use your army to help us out, what we will do is we will give you a piece of the land we conquer, and you can govern that and tax it as you see fit. Well, eventually you stop conquering, and then how do you reward those elites? You don't. And so there's a lot of tension then over that. But the main thing that brings down that first empire is the split within Islam between the Sunni and the Shia. So the split comes over this debate over who should be caliph. So should it be one of Muhammad's blood relatives? So in other words, Ali. That's what the Shia believe. It has to go through Ali's line. The Sunni believe that Muhammad's successor could be anyone who is rightly guided. And so Abu Bakr was one of the first Muslims. He was very knowledgeable about Islam. And so for the Sunni, he's the first caliph. It really comes to a head when Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet, is killed martyred by Umayyad forces as the Umayyads take control. And so that disagreement over who should run the caliphate is going to eventually cause trouble for the Umayyads. All right, so let's look at some of these terms and break down what we've got here. These can be useful in describing the appeal of Islam and how Muslims govern such a large empire. Okay, so in Islam, since the caliph is the political and religious head, there isn't a church hierarchy. So it's not like the Catholic Church, which has a pope and then archbishops and bishops and priests. And so at the center is the pope, who makes really all the final decisions about doctrine. Instead, you have a group of scholars who determine the proper practices of Islam. And so what these scholars were doing is they were studying the Quran, the holy book, but they were also studying the traditions that Muhammad had established. Those are called the Hadith. And the ulama then is this group of scholars who become an elite within the empire. So the ulama then is an institution that helps to set out doctrine, but it's also flexible because as Islam spreads, there could be scholars in any of those areas that could be eventually considered part of the ulama. They could come from Timbuktu. They could come from Western India. It really didn't matter because there wasn't a set church hierarchy. The ulama will help to establish Sharia, which is Islamic law. And so we talked a good deal about Sharia in connection to merchants, because as a result of Muhammad's role as a political and religious head, Sharia law includes within it a lot of political and economic rules. And so converting to Islam means that you are under Sharia, whether or not you are in the caliphate, that is true. And so we talk about the broader Islamic world as Dar al-Islam. So Dar al-Islam includes the caliphate, but it also includes eventually Mali and West Africa and the Delhi Sultanate and Southeast Asian Muslim states that arise, East African Muslim states that arise. If you are part of the Muslim world, you are in Dar al-Islam. So it's the world at peace is what it means. And so this entity, Dar al-Islam, is going to be the focus of the trading system in the post-classical era. And so Arab merchants are going to come to dominate that trading system. So all of this is true by 1200. By 1200, you have a caliphate, the Abbasids, that govern an empire that stretches from North Africa across the Middle East into India, but unites Muslims, even if they are not in the caliphate, through Islamic law, Sharia. So back when we were covering the early modern period, you addressed a changeover time prompt about how empires govern diverse populations. And one of the misconceptions I noticed was that people thought that the Ottoman policies in governing the dhimmi were new. And there were some new elements the way the Ottomans governed conquered people. But I have this here to show that by 1200, and even earlier than that, what the caliphate had done is they had come up with a way to incorporate the dhimmi, the people of the book, so Christians and Jews. So in the first paragraph, it tells you how Christians and Jews were second-class citizens, right? They couldn't hold a public office. They couldn't ride horses. If you were a Muslim, you didn't want to hear Christians and Jews. So this shows the superiority of Muslims in that society. However, if you were a Christian or a Jew, then you lived in what was essentially a self-governing community. Now, this will later be formalized by the Ottomans in the millet system, but you can see the foundation of it here. In spite of the treatment of Christians and Jews as second-class citizens, compared to some of the other practices we've talked about in world history, this was exceptionally tolerant. Kind of keeping people separate, but allowing them to live as they wanted to live. So not tolerant in the modern sense, but tolerant compared to what the Spanish would do, where they would use the Inquisition to hunt you down and persecute you, even if you believed in a slightly different version of Christianity. And so this is the starting point. We've got in the Quran, in the teachings of Muhammad, this dictate that the people of the book will be tolerated. And so we see that as a policy of the caliphate, and is going to endure as a policy throughout the period of Islamic empires. All right, so the starting point of the course is 1200, so we've got the by 1200 part. Now we want to look at the collapse of the Abbasids and the developments that follow that. So what we want to kind of start with is around 1200, the Abbasids, in forming an empire, had become the hub of the wheel, right? We talked about the Abbasids as the hub of trade. The Silk Roads go right through the caliphate. A lot of the Indian Ocean trade routes and Mediterranean sea routes converge on parts of the caliphate. And so that makes the caliphate the center of trade. So there are other wealthy societies out there in places like India and China, but they are not as important as carriers of trade and as diffusers of ideas as the Abbasids. So the Abbasids will then build on ideas from other places. So we talked already about how the Muslims picked up on the Indian concept of zero and the decimal number system, and they use it to build algebra, and so a new system of math. Or they take ideas from the classical European world on philosophy or in architecture, like the dome, and they're able to improve in their construction of domed buildings. And so that is an example of how the Mongols both preserve, or the Muslims both preserve and innovate based on things that had come out of the earlier post-classical and classical world. So you can see on the map, they come right up almost to the Tang Dynasty of China. And so in the map of the Abbasid dynasty goes all the way into Central Asia. And China went all the way from the other direction. And so ideas like gunpowder and the compass, paper making techniques are all going to transfer as well. And so kind of in the bigger picture, that meant if a society was connected to the Muslim world, that they were going to benefit from technology and ideas that came from the Muslims themselves, but also came from other societies. And on the flip side, if you weren't connected to the Muslim world, you're in trouble in the long run. You're not going to be able to build on the same ideas and technology. As time goes on, the caliphs in Baghdad, the capital, become much more concerned with luxury and living the good life. So remember that if you were the caliph, then you had lived your entire life in luxury, and you were the head, by the Abbasid period, of a fairly centralized bureaucratic system. So there is a prime minister who will take care of the day-to-day operations of the government, even if you do nothing. And so then, would you do anything? Would you wake up early and read correspondence and run the day-to-day affairs of the empire? Probably not. And the caliphs are the same way. So as time goes on, the caliphs lose control of the areas far away from Baghdad. Now, at the same time, we have groups emerge that are military threats to the caliphate. And so the Turks, who come from parts of Central Asia, are one example of that. The Turks converted to Islam. They were Muslims themselves, but begin to form what we would call successor states, states that are more or less independent from the caliphate, although they are nominally part of the caliphate. And so the Seljuk Turks establish a state that is still supposedly under the rule of the caliph. So they're still recognizing the religious authority of the caliph, but is in every other way independent. And there are a variety of other Turkic groups that are going to try to do the same thing. It's the expansion of the Seljuk Turks at the expense of both the Caliphate and the Byzantine Empire that's going to prompt the Crusades, the European Crusades. So the Ottoman Turks, we'll talk about in a minute, that's a different Turkic group. There were a variety of Turkic groups who were doing this. So already we can see political weakness in the area. The Caliphate continues to exist in name only, but it is becoming more fragmented. And what does it in finally is the Mongol invasion. The caliph, the final caliph, makes the mistake of not conceding to the Mongols. So remember, what the Mongols were after was wealth. They just wanted to steal your stuff. So if you surrendered quickly, then that was a way to survive. They would still steal your stuff, but they wouldn't enslave you or kill you. The caliph chooses to resist. And so there are a variety of accounts of what happens to the caliph as a result of that. And when the Mongols take Baghdad, they execute the caliph. And so, according to one account, they execute the caliph by showing a lot of respect for him. The Mongols valued horses and they valued carpets as semi-nomadic people. And so they rolled the caliph into his carpets and had him trampled by his horses. That was actually the nicer form of execution. And the other version, they accused the caliph of only desiring wealth. And so they lock him in a room with his treasure and no food, and say, if you love wealth so much, then you survive on it. Eat your wealth. And the caliph ends up dying of starvation as a result of that. But whichever account is true, if either one is true, this is a catastrophic event, because up until this time, Islam had been more or less politically successful. Even when the Seljuk Turks conquered part of the caliphate, this was conquest by other Muslims. The Mongols, when they got their start, weren't Muslim. And so this seemed to be some kind of judgment from God, that the Muslims had somehow done something wrong, and that this was the punishment that had been sent. And so this is it. The caliphate splinters apart. There no longer is a political unit bringing people together in the Middle East. Even the empires that succeed are not going to unite all of the same territory. So that might lead you to believe that trade and the cultural exchange had collapsed as well, because often the two go together, political devastation and some kind of dark age, like the fall of Rome. No. Remember that the Mongols, when they come through so rapidly that they actually don't disrupt the trading system all that much. So the Silk Road trade is even easier to use than before after the Mongols established their empire. And so what follows then is something close to what we would see in Renaissance Italy. So Renaissance Italy was disunited, right? You have Venice and you have Rome and you have Genoa. You have all these different trading states. And yet there is great economic vitality and cultural productivity. And the late post-classical period in the Middle East is much the same way. So in spite of the lack of political unity, Muslims and particularly Arabs continue to be the main carriers of trade in the Indian Ocean and continue to make a boatload of money on the trade that's going on here. And so as time has gone on, there's been a power vacuum that opens up, but there isn't necessarily much of a downturn in trade. And so one of the ways we see this is the spread of the Black Death, which we talked about. It spreads along trade routes, and so hits all of the trading centers. And you can see it spreads. Now, not so much in the southern parts, because the rats that carry the fleas didn't like deserts. But you can see how it just runs through all of the trading areas in the Middle East and then into Europe. Devastating as it occurs. All right, this was one of the things we talked about when we got into the early modern Middle East. Here is the Dev Shirami, and so you can see the description. Slavery was less degrading in the Islamic world than in the Christian world. So less degrading is the key, right? Not that it was not degrading at all. For a lot of people, it still did involve agricultural labor or something even worse than that, mind slaves or sexual slaves. What they're saying here is that if you were enslaved, then, and you were a person of talent, there were two avenues available for you. One was to become a member of the bureaucracy, and there are examples of prime ministers who worked their way up as former slaves. Or you could join the Janissaries, which is the elite gunpowder force. And so you were a slave of the Sultan, if that was the case. So these people were taken from Christian areas, converted to Islam, and given a chance to work their way up the system if they were people of talent. That is going to bring us to the modern era, or the early modern era, and I'm going to focus mainly here on the Ottoman Empire. The Safavid Empire also arises during this period, and we'll touch on them a little bit, but we're going to focus more on the Ottomans because I think they provide some really good examples of the trends of this time. And so what we are looking at kind of over a broader area is what sometimes is referred to by historians as the military revolution. And it is exactly what it sounds like. It's a revolution mostly in gunpowder weapons. So gunpowder has to be manufactured. The weapons have to be manufactured. The soldiers that use gunpowder weapons have to be well trained. Those soldiers are generally going to fight on foot. So they have to be infantry. So that means that the older ways of levying soldiers, which generally involved using your elite as kind of a part-time army, and your elite would fight from horseback, they're not going to work. And so that you need money to manufacture the weapons, to hire the foot soldiers, to train the foot soldiers. So this is an exceptionally expensive type of transition. And that is one of the reasons why the Ottomans, in trying to develop a centralized system that can fund this kind of military, why they rely on the Devshirme. And so they're capturing people and enslaving them, which means they can cut out at least part of that cost. We've talked about this in other areas of the world. The Europeans, for instance, go through a much more difficult transition to centralization as a result of the military revolution. But kind of the bigger picture is that the military revolution is putting a lot of pressure on societies to become centralized. And the Devshirme enables the Sultan to choose bureaucrats and to choose soldiers who would be personally loyal to him. He is able to circumvent the noble families and to kind of cut them out of this process. So this is similar to what we would see in France during this time, or in Japan during this time. We were trying to reduce elite power. Now, this is more of a balancing act than that. So remember, the usual transfer is you're going to take political power away, but in exchange, you're going to give some kind of economic benefit or some kind of prestige benefit. And so you would, in this case, have to balance several elite groups in the Ottoman Empire. So the Janissaries are going to emerge as an elite group. Your bureaucrats are going to be an elite group, but your older elite groups would be the ulama, your educated religious leaders, and the old Turkic chiefs. You have to keep all of them happy. You can't just take power away from them if you're the Sultan. So the Ottoman Empire is going to reach its peak because it's going to be able to tax people more effectively through that centralized bureaucracy, fund gunpowder armies and gunpowder navies that are highly effective. And so we see over there Suleiman, who's known as Suleiman the Magnificent, who was feared by Europeans. He was for a while perceived as invincible by Europeans because he had gone from one success to another due to that kind of centralization. It is also going to fund artistic innovations, and so you see the mosque in the center there. Suleiman rebuilt Constantinople as well, and two mosques using that kind of domed terracing are going to be constructed during that time. The Suleymaniye Mosque and the Blue Mosque. And those are symbols of the artistic innovations that come about as a result of the wealth flowing through the Ottoman Empire. So what occurs as the Ottomans expand through this centralization is they come into greater conflict with two rival states. And these states become religious rivals as well. So on the eastern frontier, so if you look at the map and follow to the east where you see Calderon, Calderon was the site of a major battle between the Safavids and the Ottomans. The Ottomans won, but one of the things that the Ottomans are going to find is that in spite of the centralization, with the technology of the day, it was really difficult to project power from Istanbul, from Constantinople, very far, right? So you can kind of draw a circle around Istanbul, and it almost touches the borders in every case, right? So Calderon was as far to the east as the Ottomans could really effectively go. And the Ottomans were using a version of Islam, Sunni Islam, as a legitimizing force. The Sultan, in fact, claimed to be the Caliph of the Sunni, whereas to the east of Calderon, you would have predominantly Shia Muslims. And so the Safavids eventually embrace Shia Islam as their state religion. And so the divisions between Sunni and Shia Islam are intensified by the political conflict between the Ottomans and the Safavids. The Holy Roman Empire, the HRE up there, is the Holy Roman Empire. It's basically a German empire. It's run by the Austrians, the Habsburgs, and they're Christian. All right, so now this is a Christian-Muslim rivalry, among other things. And the Habsburgs had the good fortune of inheriting the Spanish throne, which meant that they took control of Spanish territories in the New World. And so that enables the Holy Roman Empire, which was not nearly as centralized as the Ottoman Empire, to use silver from the New World, or use Spanish wealth essentially to fund a lot of the conflicts with the Ottoman Empire. And so you can see where Vienna is. The Ottomans come pretty close to taking Vienna on two occasions. And so this again is going to intensify a religious division between Muslims and Christians in that part of the world. So in spite of all the conflict I just described, the Ottomans still occupy a great geographic position. So Istanbul was a gateway of trade. So the Silk Roads coming across Asia were terminating there. If you look down where the Red Sea is, the Ottoman cities around the Red Sea were basically the end point of Indian Ocean trade routes. And so that meant for a while, if you were in the western part of the world and you want to buy Chinese silk or porcelain or Indian cotton or Indian pepper, then you really had to go through the Ottomans. And so there's this boom in trade that occurs as a result of this. You know, the Ottomans themselves had products that other people wanted. They were great producers of textiles and ceramics, and they were the first to use coffee as a major consumer goods. Now, on the other hand, what happens as a result of the growing trade during the early modern period is that raw materials also become more valuable. So if you can maximize your raw material production while driving down the cost of labor, then you can make more money. And so this leads to the intensification of peasant labor. So in some areas of the Ottoman Empire, like Istanbul, we would see much greater artisan production. In other areas of the Ottoman Empire, like the southern part of Egypt, we would see a lot of peasant labor to produce raw materials that they could sell on the world market. Okay, so here we have a source from a document from John Reed, who seems to have been put on this earth to provide AP history students with documents from the 19th century. So you've encountered one of his documents before when we talked about Ottoman modernization. So here, what he is talking about is one of the problems that the Ottomans run into. So we just sketched out the peak of the Ottoman Empire. So at its peak, the only way that European empires could fight the Ottoman Empire on an equal footing was to bring in silver from the Americas. If the Europeans hadn't had silver from the Americas, there would have been no way, no chance that they could have fielded the same kinds of armies and navies. And so then we get to a point, in the later part of the 19th century, where now the Europeans have kind of reversed the advantage. So here's one of the reasons why. The Janissaries, which were at one point a source of strength, had outlived their usefulness. You need to get rid of them. And so this is, as Reed points out, what Selim wants to do. And so he is pointing out that the changes and improvements introduced by Selim were far from giving general satisfaction. The mass of people looked upon every one of them as a deviation from the letter of the Quran. So remember that what Selim is doing here is he is westernizing. He is imitating Europe. And so this makes him, this causes him to appear to many of his subjects as a sellout. Here he is giving in to the Christians, so why would he do that? Kind of mentality here. And then the other thing we see is that what he's trying to do is basically to industrialize. And so industrialization means you're producing by machine and you have factories. So there are a variety of groups that would be hurt by industrialization. So if you industrialize and you move people to factories and you produce by machines, then artisans are out of the job for the most part, because you don't need hand production nearly as much. It's going to produce a need for education, and the state is going to try to provide that education. Well, if the state is providing education, now the ulama has lost influence, and so they're not going to be happy about that. And then if you want to produce a Western-style military, which is now following a breakthrough during the Napoleonic Wars, where you have these corps that use what we call combined arms. Some of the people in the corps are going to be on horse, some of them are going to be on foot, and some of them are going to know how to use artillery. Well, to use artillery, you really have to understand math. And so that means you have to completely overhaul your military and train people in a different way. And so the Janissaries, by this time, had become, the Janissary position had become hereditary. It was no longer a product of the Dashirmi. And so the Janissaries aren't going to want that, right? So we have several groups then who feel like any type of modernization is going to cause them to lose power and influence. The Janissaries, the ulama, the artisans, among others. And so that's the reason for the Ottoman decline. There are institutions that need to be overhauled. Ottoman rulers, in fact, recognized institutions that needed to be overhauled. But it is one thing to say we need to change this institution, and it is another to actually do it. And we see that in our own society. There are things that we see, they're not working so well, but changing it, it can be pretty hard to do. There can be a lot of disagreement. And so what kind of crystallizes the Ottoman failure to keep up is the rivalry with Russia. And so go back in time to 1600. So in 1600, Russia was weak. Russia in 1600 could not expand into the southern areas at the expense of the Ottoman Empire. They couldn't defeat Poland, Russia. And then, as a result of the westernizing efforts of Peter and then Catherine the Great of Russia, Russia now had a European-style army where they're manufacturing everything they need, at least for the military. And so now Russia has a tremendous advantage over the Ottoman Empire. Their ships are better, their guns are better, their cannon are better. And so the result of that had been that the Ottoman Empire was steadily losing territory to the Russians. And this culminates with the Crimean War. So right around 1850, Russia decides that the Ottoman Empire is the sick man of Europe, and so therefore should be put out of its misery, and everybody should just carve it up, and it should divide up the Ottoman Empire. And so that is going to result in the Crimean War. Well, the only thing that saves the Ottoman Empire in the Crimean War is that the British and the French were afraid of what would happen if Russia got all that Ottoman territory. So they prop up the Ottoman Empire. And so, but at this point, clearly the Ottoman Empire has fallen behind and needs to catch up quickly. And so that is what really crystallizes it. But even before that, there had been some events that showed that the Ottomans were behind and they needed to catch up. So over to the right, we have Mahmud II and the auspicious incident of 1826. So learning from the mistakes of Selim, Mahmud II liquidated the Janissaries, essentially lured them into a trap, and then wiped out every one of them that tried to resist him. So there was no more Janissary force after 1826 to resist. And so what follows is an effort then to reform. It's called Tanzimat. Tanzimat runs roughly from 1839 to 1876. 1839 when it was first proclaimed to 1876 when the constitution that was created under Tanzimat was suspended. And so the Tanzimat reforms involved a good deal of westernizing reform, trying to industrialize, creating a constitution and a legislature, granting rights to religious minorities in the Ottoman Empire. And so again, there's a good deal of elite resistance to this. And so this is part of the reason why these reforms don't happen faster than they might. If you're the Sultan, anytime you institute a reform that is strongly disliked by one of these elite groups, you run the risk of being overthrown. And so eventually what the Ottomans do in 1876 is they suspend the constitution. They try to reform the military only without introducing broader reforms to society, and fall farther and farther behind. In 1908, there's a coup carried out by a group called the Young Turks that does push forward a modernizing agenda, but by that time it's too late. The Ottoman Empire gets involved in 1914, which destroys the empire. But kind of leading up to what happens there, so we have on the one hand this problem with a failure to modernize. On the other hand, the model of a multinational empire had basically seen its day by the 19th century. So remember that these empires ruling over diverse populations had been a constant from the earliest states. If we go back to the Babylonian Empire, all the way through each empire we've looked at, all of those empires had governed lots of different language and religious groups. But what makes that a problem is the development of nationalism. And so as nationalism catches on and as people are drawn to nationalism as a form of unity, so they're saying we prefer to have unification based on a shared language than unification based on loyalty to the Sultan and practice of Islam. And what that does is it splinters the Ottoman Empire apart. And you can see on this map part of how that's going to happen, especially in southeastern Europe. So that's an area called the Balkans, where Serbia is going to emerge, and Bulgaria, earlier on Greece, and so problematic in Arabia and Egypt is going to be Arab nationalism, where the Arabs start to doubt that the Sultan, who is a Turk, is really representing all Muslims. And so there's this desire among Arabs to form their own states. And so that splintering is kind of breaking the Ottoman Empire apart as internally the political system is becoming weaker and weaker and weaker. And so that's why when the empire gets itself involved in a total war, the total war is just going to destroy it. And so we will end up with a Turkic successor state again, which will be Turkey. But otherwise, Arab states break away, European states break away, and the Ottoman Empire goes into full collapse. But it was a good run. If you think about empires and how long they last, this empire really gets going in 1453 when Constantinople is taken, and doesn't collapse until 1919. And so that shows us that the institutions put together were fairly effective. All right, so that is it for the Middle East. So next we're going to move on to Europe, and we'll talk about Western Europe and then Eastern Europe, and we'll finish our review with China and Japan.